This week, Q&A features a documentary about Hubert Humphrey. Producer Mick Caouette joins us to talk about his program that traces Humphrey's life from mayor to senator to vice president to presidential candidate.
Mick Caouette, when did you first think about doing a documentary on Hubert Humphrey?
It would have been in the late fall of 1999. I was working at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I ran across the Humphrey collection, which is just, it's enormous. There's 1,200 manuscript boxes, large manuscript boxes, 10,000 films, 10,000 photographs, 5,000 audio tapes. And I had started I started documentary work earlier, maybe 3 years earlier, and I thought, why hasn't anyone ever done this? I mean, this was a gold mine of material. And then I learned more about him. I mean, I grew up in Minneapolis. He was part of my childhood, but I didn't really know that much about him, and he's really been kind of forgotten, even in Minnesota. But all this material just you know, thrilled me. So that's how I started, really. And as I dug into it, it was wonderful.
Who was he?
Who was he? I think he was more of a humanitarian than he was a politician, frankly. I think he used politics as a religion. His mother wanted him to be a preacher, and I think he said, you know, he felt it was a better vehicle than church. And that's kind of how he used politics.
25 years in the Senate?
I believe it was 25, yes, maybe 30, closer to 30, because he had 5 terms. So, no, it'd be 25, you're right.
And 4 years as vice president, and how many years was he mayor of Minneapolis?
It actually only turned out to be about 3. He was elected to a second term, or would have been, but then he became senator.
How well did you know him personally?
I didn't know him at all.
Never met him?
Never met him. Just about everybody I know has met him, but I haven't.
So jump ahead. How long did it take you to do the documentary, and where did it air first?
Oh, it took a long time. I started, actually, first Hamline University gave me seed money in 2000, and then all the way till really 2010. And it was a long process, not so much of making the film, but of raising money and finding a venue and all that sort of thing, and finding the old film. We interviewed 52 people in 10 cities, so we had 120 hours of interviews. It was a long process, and I had a little short stint at another PBS station, and that didn't go well. It lasted 2 years. I just said, forget it, and I went home and bought a Mac and edited the film myself with another guy.
You edited this film on a Mac?
With Joe Palo, who's another great editor from Minneapolis.
Well, let's show a little bit from the documentary. What did you name it, and where did you get the name?
The name came from what Humphrey believed, and I don't know if he ever said it, but he really did believe that politics was the art of the possible. Anything could happen within our system.
The Happy Warrior.
The Happy Warrior, yeah.
Let's watch a couple minutes and we'll continue.
Sounds good.
Humphrey and his supporters arrived in the hall in the early afternoon of the final day of the convention. He had been up all night writing his speech. He lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. He was exhausted, yet determined, as his growing commitment to human rights was crystallizing in this moment. He knew the risk. If he pushed the Southerners too far, they would deliver on their threats to leave the convention and split the party in 2. The final day dragged on. With no air conditioning, the inside temperature soared into the 90s. But before the weary delegates could vote, they would have to sit through more than an hour of speeches condemning the civil rights plank.
You shall not crucify the South on this cross of civil rights.
As the Philadelphia police patrolled the aisles, Humphrey anxiously awaited his turn. He was only 37 years old and about to confront the most powerful forces in American politics, with his own future and that of the Democratic Party hanging in the balance. As his moment finally arrived, the heat near the platform became unbearable.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Democrats, fellow Americans, I realize that in speaking in behalf of the Minority Report on Civil Rights, that I'm dealing with a charged issue, with an issue which has been confused by emotionalism on all sides of the fence. I feel I must rise at this time to support the Minority Report a report that spells out our democracy, a report that the people of this country can and will understand, and a report that they will enthusiastically acclaim on the great issue of civil rights. To those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late.
Humphrey drew a line in the sand, and his words reverberated throughout the country as 60 million people listened at home and work.
The time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
After the speech, the applause lasted over 10 minutes. When the final vote was taken on the civil rights plank, Humphrey and his supporters won a stunning victory. In the middle of the noisy crowd, Birmingham Police Commissioner Bull Connor led the Dixiecrats out of the hall and out of the Democratic Party.
A lot to ask you about Dixiecrats. Who were they?
They were a group of Southerners who had sort of began to oppose Truman because Truman's earlier stand on civil rights, especially that year, and they were the Southern segregationists. Those were, I believe, there were something like 17 states were involved total, but there were Mississippi and the Carolinas and Alabama were some of the the front people, and they did not want any talk of civil rights. And they wanted Truman defeated, and so they put up their own candidate.
Where did you get that? I know you talked about all the video. Where did you get that black and white video we just saw?
It's mostly Universal newsreels, almost entirely, except for which is a great collection at National Archive in College Park. It's available. It's public domain, so it's a wonderful resource. But there's also the shots of him on the podium, and some of the shots of the crowd, the Minnesota crowd, came from a man from South Minneapolis who had a 16mm camera. And he shot he must have run out of film or something. It was a crank camera, I'm sure. And he shot the few seconds of him on the podium and a few other seconds. And it was silent. And so what we did is we found the audio tape and then we synced it up to him speaking, so that you could see him speak with the silent film. So.
Here's a familiar face who was a Democrat at the time, Strom Thurmond.
Right.
That it's another effort on the part of the president to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights. And I'll tell you, the American people from one side or the other had better wake up and oppose such a program, and if they don't, the next thing will be a totalitarian state in these United States.
Those people were bad people, and we had spent our lives being powerless, We'd spent our lives being powerless in the face of their power, their craftiness, and their determination to keep us submerged in American life. So this was for us a morality play of the greatest dimension, and Hubert was our knight in shining armor.
You don't hear people say, Roger Wilkins, who just said it, these were bad people.
I know.
Did you ask him about why he said that? Why were we so
Well,
strong?
we had been talking about it. It was a long interview. It was a 2-hour interview. He just thought that at their heart they were segregationists and they were racists at their heart, a lot of them. And he just thought they were people who were never going to do anything good for African Americans. He just felt they were just bad at the core in that way. Morally, I guess.
Strom Thurmond, was he governor of the state of South Carolina?
He was governor then, yes. He became senator.
And when did he switch parties? Do you remember?
After the Civil Rights Bill. And then you'll see him later on, of course, at the '68 Republican convention standing next to Richard Nixon, walking out with him. He did.
And you said, I mean, one of the things in that first clip that we saw was the reference to 60 million people were listening. I know that was on television, but very few people could even see that.
Right.
How important was radio in those days?
Well, it was the medium, and the fact that there were 60 million and there were maybe, I don't know what, maybe 180, 200 million in the country. That was a pretty good size of. I mean, when you consider it's a political convention, that's a pretty good group of people. And I when I first read that early on, I thought it must have been 6 million, but I checked it out more than once, and it was 60 million people were listening. And there were the TV was on the East Coast. It was sort of closed circuit, and it was to a few stations, and it was in D.C. The president watched it on TV. It was very, very little network, on the East Coast, and that was it. Other than that, TV was really nowhere else. So radio was it.
He was running for the Senate, Hubert Humphrey, then?
He declared in the spring, and he declared in the spring.
I must say this next clip will surprise a lot of people. In spite of how many times you've heard what he was in his early days. Let's run this, and you'll see what I mean.
The speech ignited his Senate campaign and put him front and center on the national stage. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt remarked to the press that he has that spark of greatness. And he caught the attention of other prominent Democrats.
Now to Ronald Reagan in Hollywood. This is Ronald Reagan speaking to you from Hollywood. You know me as a motion picture actor. But tonight I'm just a citizen, and more than a little impatient with those promises the Republicans made before they got control of Congress a couple of years ago. And this is why we must have new faces in the Congress of the United States. Democratic faces. I take great pride in presenting my friend from Minneapolis, Mayor Hubert H. Humphrey, candidate for United States Senator.
In November of 1948, Harry Truman won a historic upset. And making history of his own, Hubert H. Humphrey became Minnesota's first Democratic senator.
Being a romantic and idealistic person, when he went to Washington in 1948, I think he probably felt that this was going to be Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and this place of marble monuments that was just waiting for him to come there and change the world and crusade. And very quickly, his dreams and idealism collided with reality.
The reality was a Senate dominated by the same Dixiecrats Humphrey had angered with his civil rights speech the summer before. And they would not go easy on Hubert Humphrey.
After all, I had been the destroyer of the Democratic Party, the enemy of the South. Hubert Humphrey, the quote-unquote nigger lover. But I never felt so lonesome and so unwanted in all my life as I did in those first few weeks and months as United States Senator.
Where did you find the Ronald Reagan clip?
That was in the Humphrey collection. It was actually a radio program. It was for the National Ladies Garment Workers Union. He was speaking for a union on a union program, and he was the Screen Actors Guild president at that time.
We knew that he was a supporter of FDR's, but I don't know that I've ever heard that he was outwardly supporting Hubert Humphrey. Did they know each other? Did you ever find out?
Oh, yeah, they were good friends all through their lives. Yeah. In fact, Ronald Reagan had a dedication to Humphrey when he was in the White House. And I don't know if I can tell you the details of it, but they had a nice dedication where they were really good friends. He stayed at the ranch all the time, and Humphrey did. They were close friends. According
to the liner notes, the woman who is the announcer and the narrator is Mary Easter?
Easter, yeah.
Who is she?
She is a retired dance professor from Carleton College in Minneapolis, and she's really not done much of this. She's just a natural. What's remarkable about it is that she read through the entire script one time without seeing the film.
And why did you pick her?
I used her on another film earlier, and we had talked to Richard Dreyfuss, and we'd talked to a couple other people, Garrison Keillor, and it occurred to me, over the period of Humphrey's life, and if you see films about the '60s, he's kind of a painting on the wall. He's always just sort of non-existent. And of course, he was right in the middle of things, and all the attention is always taken away from him, and that was partly his fault because he gave things away. But you'll hear about Kennedy, you'll hear about Johnson, you won't hear much about Humphrey. And I was afraid that if I had a famous person narrate, it would become about that person again, and Humphrey would get shadowed. So I decided to use someone that I liked and wasn't necessarily famous, although she sounds like a number of people, so people mistake her for, but she's got a wonderful voice.
And her name is Mary Easter.
Yep.
Still in Minneapolis?
Yeah, she's retired, and she grew up in Richmond during Jim Crow, so she knows, she has a sensitivity to the history. So.
Did she know Hubert Humphrey?
I don't think she did, no. She moved to Minnesota quite late.
1948, he was elected to the Senate, and then he challenged JFK to the presidency in 59, 60?
60, yeah, right.
We've got some of your film here to look at.
Okay.
In the spring of 1959, Humphrey entered the presidential primaries against a young senator named John F. Kennedy. With more enthusiasm than money, he met the media at every opportunity.
How do you think your race is going?
Well, like this roller coaster, it's been an uphill fight, but I think we've been doing quite well.
Now, would you mind telling me what has been the most exciting part of the campaign so far?
I just had it.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, I tell you, this is good fun.
Thank you, sir.
And politics ought to be fun.
Yes, sir.
So vote for Hubert Humphrey, the president for you and me.
I love this nation. I think it ought to set a great example for the whole world, really to cast a beacon of light and of enlightenment and of hope and of peace of the entire nation. And the president must speak for the nation, giving the philosophy and the fundamentals of our democracy and what we stand for. And then he must be able to mobilize action and carry out these programs so that the dream can be fulfilled.
While it is generally believed that John Kennedy and Richard Nixon held the first televised debate, Humphrey and Kennedy met months earlier.
In 1960, I had the opportunity to expose America to a number of my ideas. I was determined that Kennedy adopt as many of my proposals and policies as possible.
This week, I had the opportunity to debate with Mr. Nixon. I feel that I should reveal that I had a great advantage in that debate, and I'm not referring to anyone's makeup man. The advantage that I had was that Mr. Nixon had just debated with Khrushchev, and I had debated with Hubert Humphrey, and that gave me an edge.
How close did he come to beating JFK?
Well, the primary, I think he probably lost by 10% in the primary in the West Virginia and Wisconsin primaries. I think Wisconsin might have been worse, but he didn't really have a chance. But that's another whole story. Kennedy's campaign was pretty well financed, and Humphrey didn't have a lot of money, and he was really it was sort of bought out, I would have to say. And there are stories of people being handed $5 bills and all kinds of things that went on during that campaign that he really didn't have much of a chance. He was expected to win in that state, and that's why you'll hear, I think, Michael Beschloss say that he was expected to win, because it was, and it isn't so much that he went after the non-Catholic vote, but it was largely a Protestant state, and because of Kennedy's Catholicism, they didn't think he would be able to win there. So he really something had to change, and I think it's interesting, because I think if he would have won that primary, I think he would have had a challenge from Lyndon Johnson, who also wanted to run. It would have been interesting.
In the end, where did you get your funding?
Well, all kinds of places. It started out with Hamline University early on.
That's in St. Paul?
St. Paul. They gave me a seed money. And then from about 37 or 38 organizations and individuals received money over the years. The Schumann Center for Media and Democracy, which was the Schumann Foundation then, gave me the largest.
Bill Moyer's running that?
Yeah, he's the president, right. Gave me a large sum in the middle. That helped. Minnesota Humanities Commission, Minnesota Historical Society, the South Dakota Humanities Commission, AFL-CIO, I got it from all kinds of places, the Andreas Foundation, and Dwayne Andreas' family and his brother, just from all over the place. It ended up being about $600,000 and about $200,000, I would say, in kind.
So I assume there was never a time when this wasn't going to be a positive look at Hubert Humphrey's life.
Well, I started out otherwise, but I started out really wanting to look for all sides of his personality, but we interviewed 52 people, and I couldn't find anyone who didn't like him. I mean, they were all in love with him, and it seemed like the closer they got to him, the more they liked him, and it was really difficult to. And that's hard, by the way, to do a story about someone who's a good person. It's much easier if there's affairs and murders and all kinds of other things. It's much more sensational, but I couldn't really find much. He had flaws and he made mistakes, but he wasn't, basically on the inside. In fact, I asked Bill Moyers that, did he do anything bad? He said, I can't say anything bad about him because he wasn't a bad person.
Bill Moyers is quoted in your piece as saying he's one of the greatest legislators in American history.
Yeah.
Why? What's that? Where does that come from?
Well, he had his hand one way or another in 1,000 bills over 10 years. So I believe I came up with one every 3 days or something, it amounts to. And, it affects pretty much everything in our life. I mean, every piece of legislation that's now affecting our lives really came from somewhere. Hubert Humphrey was involved in one place or another. And so he knew how to get things through. At the end of the film, he says he could set lofty ideals, but he also could, like a plumber, he could work the pipeline. He knew how to work the legislature, and that's why is that he knew how to get these things done. He'd have an idea, and he would get it done.
The '64 Civil Rights Bill. Let's watch, and I'll ask you some questions about it.
One ticket. I'm sorry, I did not choose to sell your ticket. You do not choose to sell me a ticket? Is this because of my race? No comment.
I'll be admitted? No, sir, you cannot be admitted. Why? I am not going to serve you. Because of my race? I'm not going to serve you. Because of my race. Move on.
The stage was set for the legislative battle of the century. If a bill was passed, equal access to employment, schools, and public places would become law. But mistrust in the government ran deep in the black community, and failure to pass a meaningful bill could spark a second civil war.
And the injustice that has been inflicted upon Negroes in this country by Uncle Sam is criminal. Don't blame a cracker in Georgia for your injustices. The government is responsible for the injustices.
Just keep the niggas cool, Like pass the civil rights bill. Most Negroes who are aware of, who've been around, have the slightest bit of awareness of what's going on politically in the country, they take the civil rights bill as the new method of placating the Negro.
Do you think it's going to help the Negro?
And as the filibuster began, the battle lines in the Senate were clearly drawn.
Negroes have as many rights in this country as other people. They're better fed, they're better housed, and they enjoy as many benefits as other people. They have every opportunity in the world here. They have more opportunities here than in any nation in the world. I don't know of any place where they have as good housing, as many refrigerators, as many automobiles, as many dishwashers and washing machines as here in the United States.
At last, the Congress must act, because the Congress represents the people. And this means a civil rights program before Congress, and it'll be here. And I want to tell you now that we're going to carry through on this program if we have to stay here all year.
Sir, how long will you debate this bill?
Until it's defeated.
President Johnson saw the Senate as a battleground, and victory would come only after a long, bitter fight. But Humphrey insisted on a new, softer strategy that would change the legislative game.
To break a filibuster was almost an impossible task because he'd been majority leader of the Senate and had attempted to break filibusters himself.
To see how things get done in American politics, you need to study very closely what Hubert Humphrey did in the Senate in 1964 with that Civil Rights Act.
I wanted to know that to see if we would try to get on a unanimous.
He had regular strategy meetings. He organized a newsletter. He had people on watch all of the time. He enlisted one colleague in the Senate to focus on each title of the bill. He was brilliant in the way he organized his forces to challenge the filibuster and press the argument.
A lot of video there, a lot of film. Go with that first part. Was it James Farmer that was stepping up to buy the ticket?
Right.
And then right behind that, Jesse Jackson?
Yes. Yep.
Where did you find that?
CBS had found, BBC had found old civil rights footage from the 60s somewhere in their warehouse a couple of years ago, and released it. You know, it's obviously it's a pay-for kind of footage, but and they sent me a screener of all of it, and I found it in those clips a lot of material, probably 3 hours of material that I had. So as soon as I saw it, I knew it was something that I'm a little surprised. You know, they have to give you permission for some of these things. I was a little surprised some of it that they did, but I'm grateful that they did.
Why were you surprised?
Well, for instance, the Dixiecrat segment, you know, in there where the Dixiecrats are, I mean, they're just basically blatant racist and called racists by Roger Mudd, who's narrating. I didn't think that they would want that. I thought it might be a problem for them to have that out there, but they let me use it, so I was glad.
You had Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
Then you had Strom Thurmond saying some things. Where did that come from?
The Malcolm X was also from the CBS footage, and Strom Thurmond came from the. It was a documentary on the '63 march that was put out through USAID that Carl Rowan actually narrated, and it was a long hour-long documentary on the march, and it was in there, I think.
What's your philosophy when you do? By the way, how long is this?
It's just under 2 hours, hour 52 minutes. I think it's a PBS 2 hours, hour 52 minutes.
And then what's your philosophy about IDing these people? I mean, how much do you assume your audience knows?
Well, I assume they knew nothing. So we tried to ID them at least 3 times, and each person would depend on how long they've been off camera and how well they're known, of course. I mean, I didn't have to ID President Carter more than once, so I didn't have to, you know.
Here's Hubert Humphrey and Strom Thurmond in debate.
Okay.
The showdown caught the public's attention, but no cameras were allowed in the Senate. So Humphrey and Thurmond agreed to take a piece of the debate to a television audience.
And we know that fellow Americans who happen to be Negro have been denied equal access to places of public accommodation, denied in their travels the chance for a place to rest and to eat.
It's not public accommodations, it's invasion of private property. This will lead to integration of private life.
In the city of Birmingham, Alabama, up to 1963, there was an ordinance that said that if you were going to have a restaurant and you were going to permit a Negro to come in, you had to have a 7-foot wall down the middle of the restaurant dividing the white from the colored. Now, how foolish this is, and isn't that an invasion of private property?
Senator, we live in a country of freedom, and under our Constitution, a man has a right to use his own private property as he sees fit. We must remember that this bill creates no jobs. So therefore, whose jobs are these Negroes, the minority, going to take? Are the Negroes' jobs or white people's jobs?
The main thing that we ought to press on them is to get it. The delay is going to be disastrous.
After 2 months, Humphrey was exhausted and worried, feeling pressure from both the president and civil rights leaders. Finally, Everett Dirksen broke his silence with 22 amendments. When civil rights leaders demanded a tougher stand, Humphrey pleaded for patience and took Dirksen into a one-on-one closed-door session. Two weeks later, they surfaced with the bill intact and Dirksen in the spotlight.
And I, for one, want to publicly express my respect and admiration for you and my sincere thanks for what I call service beyond the call of duty and putting country ahead of every other consideration.
I could say as much for you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you, Everett.
We have lost a battle, of course, but we are not yet ready to surrender in our opposition to this bill, which we feel is a perversion of the American way of life and a great blow at the right of dominion over private property that has been the genesis of our greatness.
You know, over the years I've heard people say that Richard Russell could have been president of the United States, and it always struck me as odd because he was basically a white separatist in all this and was very much a leader against this whole civil rights bill. Why was he so respected?
Well, he'd done all kinds of other things. He was, I know the food program for children in schools and all kinds of other. in every other way, he was very much like Humphrey. I mean, they agreed on most everything. It was just civil rights. And he was a party person. He wasn't someone like Strom Thurmond who was going to split off from the party. He wanted to stay in the Democratic Party. So I think that he became sort of the Dixiecrats spokesman in the Democratic Party, where some of the others wanted to leave at times.
What party was Strom Thurmond in that debate, and who saw that debate in those days?
He was he was a Democratic senator at that point, I believe, and he was. It was seen on, I believe it was CBS. I think Eric Severide was on CBS. I think he was the narrator, Eric Severide, of that debate. And this is one of the problems I had with this whole thing, was I was trying to do a 15-minute segment on how the Civil Rights Bill was passed, and there were no cameras allowed in the Senate, so I had to do this whole thing without ever being in the room. And the whole thing took place in the room, so that was a really difficult thing to do. And one of the fines was this debate, because basically they took it outside, and people couldn't see what was going on. There was a clock running on TV showing how long the filibuster was running at times. I mean, it really had public attention. And this debate was a way to bring the whole thing to the people on TV. So it was on national TV, so one of the channels.
I went and looked at the vote totals, and I think people might be surprised at how it came out. In the House, the Democratic Party voted 61% for it and 39% against it. The Republican Party voted 80% for it and 20% against it. And in the Senate, the Democratic Party voted 69% for it and 31% against it, and the Republican Party voted 82% in favor and 18% against it.
Yeah.
So it's so much different than it is today as far as the breakup of the party.
Yeah.
And why did you choose? Why was the Civil Rights Bill so important to your documentary?
Well, I think it's one of the most important pieces of legislation in the 20th century. Besides that, Humphrey thought it was his biggest accomplishment, and I have to agree.
In his life?
In his life, yeah. In his career, yeah. I mean, you would consider his family his biggest accomplishment, but in his career it was. And it's very much like the healthcare bill. It was the same kind of struggle. I mean, and the same kind of maneuvering had to be done to get it done. And the Republican Party at that point had a fairly good record on civil rights. I mean, they weren't. The real problem was in the Democratic Party. It was really the Dixiecrats were the real problem. And the coalition he formed to get it passed was really with the Republicans, with Dirksen and the Republicans. He needed them to get it passed. So it wasn't so much that the Democratic Party was against it. It was just that one segment. And then the other problem is that they only needed 51% to get the bill passed, but they needed 67 votes to stop the filibuster. And that was the real problem. And now, of course, I think it's 60. But it was 67 in those days. And they knew that if they got the 67 votes, passing the bill wouldn't be difficult.
Why did it take you 11 years to get this done, or 10 years, or whatever it was?
Well, we did 52 interviews in 10 cities, 120 hours. That took about 4 years at the beginning. Then I got connected to another PBS station, which will go unnamed, and spent about 2 years with them, and it just wasn't working at all. And it got to be now 2008 by this time. And so I just left, and I went home and bought myself a Mac and started editing myself with another editor, as I said, Joe Palo, and then we edited the film. And then in 2009 sometime, Bill Grant from WNET got interested. And, the rest is the process of getting it on TV at that point. PBS wasn't interested for some reason. They liked it, but they wouldn't do it for some reason that we've never really been told. But American Public Television was, and that's, of course, another producing organization for public TV. They were really excited about it, so that's how it got done. And at this date, it's broadcast 600 times in a couple hundred cities, so it's had a pretty wide...
So each individual public station had to decide whether they wanted to put it on.
That's right. It was not a required program.
From your documentary, here is Hubert Humphrey, and around the 1964 period when he was selected as vice president with Lyndon Johnson.
We looked to a really kind of equal partnership. And in the first few days, we thought it would be that way. We were going to be a part of everything. And, of course, then events intervened, including most dramatically Humphrey's break with Johnson in a cabinet meeting on Vietnam.
Only days into the new administration, the Viet Cong attacked an American base in Pleiku, and Johnson called a cabinet meeting to sanction the bombing of North Vietnam.
Johnson was not looking for advice, but validation. And it was actually Johnson looking for ratification of what he'd already decided. He goes around the room and asking all these people, his advisors, to tell him what they think about this decision to launch these attacks. And Humphrey announces that he thinks that it's a mistake.
Johnson was furious with him, and the bombing of the North began.
Congress gave us this authority in August 1964 to do whatever may be necessary. That's pretty far-reaching. The sky's the limit.
While there may have been no limits on Johnson's expansion of the Vietnam War, there would now be limits on his vice president.
I knew him intensely for those years of the 60s, and that was the most tortured period of his life, as he was trying to be vice president, serving the president who was taking us to war in Vietnam, even as he had misgivings as an independent thinker.
After their public disagreement, Humphrey was frozen out of all discussion of Vietnam. Johnson cut off his privileges, reduced his staff, censored his speeches, tapped his phones, and ordered his own staff not to speak to him.
Vice President of the United States. How deep was that split? I mean, how far did the president go with his own vice president?
Well, you didn't want to be on Johnson's bad side, as many people know, and it was largely about Vietnam, but of course he expanded that behavior into the rest of his relationship with Humphrey. I mean, he still had a relationship with him because the Great Society programs and all the rest, but it was cold, and he was shut out of any discussion of Vietnam, and Vietnam was, of course, it became the main issue of the Johnson presidency at one point. He was pretty cold with him. He basically wanted him to know that he does not disagree with the president about anything.
How outspoken was Hubert Humphrey at any time in his life about that split that those two had?
Humphrey was not someone who held grudges or really talked about anyone else. He would pretty much have just said, well, that's part of being vice president, and I knew what I was getting into. That's what he would have said. In fact, he did say that at times. So I don't think he would have talked openly about it. He and Bill Moyers interviewed him in 1976, and actually on the DVD there's a 15-minute conversation between Moyers and Humphrey from a cut from the Bill Moyers Journal, and it's a bonus thing. And they talked about Johnson, and they both agreed that he could be, it was almost like abusive relationship with people. He would be very kind and loving, and then you do something wrong, and then he would shut you out for the next 2 months, and then he'd come back, and so you never knew where you stood with him. And
by the way, if somebody wants this documentary, can they buy it?
ShopPBS.org or 1-800-PBS, which is ShopPBS, which is the PBS distribution.
SHOP, ShopPBS.org.
Yeah.
And you can buy. How much is it?
It's $24.95. It can be bought in other places too. I mean, other retailers have it too. It's pretty much everywhere.
Here is, as everybody knows, it's at least our age, that Hubert Humphrey ran for president in '68. But here's this difficulty of going in and out of Vietnam and what he sees from your documentary.
Opposition to the war grew, and since Humphrey was defending it, Humphrey lost his credibility with not only his traditional liberal constituencies, but many others as well.
Humphrey, remember, had positioned himself as the champion of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and it appeared to us that he traded that in for power.
He seemed very quickly almost like a caricature of himself, given what he believed and how he was by nature and by temperament versus what people were seeing every night on their television screens.
300 body bags coming back every week. Things that I don't think Johnson or Humphrey anticipated. The endlessness of it. The being lied to by the Pentagon about a few more bombs will do the job.
By the end of Humphrey's first year as vice president, there were nearly 200,000 American troops on the ground in Vietnam. But there was another war going on inside the country. And while Humphrey was sent to the front lines, Johnson slipped into his own private hell in the White House.
The war was taking its toll upon the patience of the country, a war that no one understood and so many people were bitterly opposed to, a war that was never really explained to the American people. But whatever the reasons for the upheaval in American society, the fact is we were experiencing a veritable revolution.
By December of 1967, there were nearly 400,000 American troops in Southeast Asia, and Humphrey was sent on yet another trip to Vietnam. But this time it would be different, as Humphrey was determined to see the war close up.
They gave us a dog and pony show with film and slides, just a wholly, propaganda proposition. We went to the military hospital at Da Nang. Humphrey insisted on going into the intensive care ward, and he spent about an hour and a half with the boys who were dying. Yeah. And seeing on the ground what was happening to our kids, and seeing how corrupt the Vietnamese were, and how quite willing they were to let us stand there forever and do the fighting, he came back changed. And we wrote a very, very strong report to Johnson, telling him that we got to get out of there. Johnson called a cabinet meeting and asked Humphrey to report on Vietnam. And he gave Humphrey a note which said, "Hubert, give short, upbeat report. Progress good, then sit down and shut up. Lyndon."
How long ago did you do the interview with Ted Van Dyke?
That would have been about 2003 or 4, I think, 2004. It's been a while.
He was emotional about...
Very emotional.
Did you ever ask him why?
Well, that was the longest interview we did. I think it was about 3.5 hours, and he was emotional all the way through. He was emotional because he saw the suffering, and he couldn't go in. He said, "I couldn't go into the room where these people were dying. I saw people with arms missing and legs missing," and I think he for a long time, Ted was against the war in the middle of that whole time, so he just had a hard time with the suffering.
Was Hubert Humphrey ever dishonest with the American people about his feelings on the war?
I don't think so. I really don't. I don't think that. I think that he said he would rather be wrong than a hypocrite, and I don't think he. I think he believed what he was saying. I mean, I think when he was for the war, he was for the war, and like it or not, and whether you agreed with him or not, he wasn't lying about it. He really was for it. When he became against it, it got a lot tougher, and he didn't speak out as much. I think he was careful about what he said, but I don't think he ever really lied directly. And I know that's hard for some people. They believe he was lying all the time, but that was part of the problem, part of the reason for doing the documentary, was to show another side to this, because everyone just remembers Humphrey as someone who was licking Lyndon Johnson's boots the whole time and had no mind of his own, and people didn't understand the pressures he was under, which is, it runs through the vice presidency into 68.
And then when he ran in 68, there was a plank in the platform that you talk about in your documentary.
Right.
The anti-war convention delegates would be led by Eugene McCarthy and Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. To win the general election, Humphrey needed their support. McGovern was on board, but McCarthy hesitated.
McCarthy told me in early August, prior to the convention, that he would be able to come out for me somewhere around the middle of September. After all, Gene and myself had a rather long friendship, and we were hoping that friendship could survive.
Time was running out, and the only way that Humphrey could avoid violence in Chicago was to bring together Johnson and the anti-war Democrats. With only days remaining until the convention, Humphrey and Nixon were invited to the LBJ Ranch. While Nixon's visit was well publicized, Johnson forbid Humphrey to tell the press. Humphrey took the opportunity to present Johnson with his own proposal to end the war and unite the party.
I discussed with him the necessity of phasing out, reducing our commitments, reducing our forces, reducing our bombing, and leaving the struggle to the people in Vietnam themselves and trying to negotiate our way out of it. He frankly was furious with me. I remember what he said. He said, I have 2 son-in-laws over there, and your proposal would leave them at the mercy of the enemy. And he became very personal about it.
Working against the clock, Humphrey wrote a compromise peace plank that was agreed to by all sides, including the president's closest advisors.
Then Hubert, being vice president, as well as a presidential candidate, had declared it with the White House. The president squelched it.
And he insisted that the resolution that we have replaced by a very pro-Vietnam War resolution.
By then we knew that Hubert wanted a peace plank in the platform to end the war, and we knew that, and we knew why it didn't happen.
I don't like talking about it, it's so painful.
Last one, Walter Mondale. The footage that we saw at the ranch, you say that Lyndon Johnson didn't let him talk about the fact they had a meeting. Why, and where'd that footage come from?
That footage actually came from the LBJ library. Johnson had this, he had I guess for historians it's actually turned out to be a nice thing to have, but he had he had someone follow him around all the time with a 60mm camera, and then at the end of the month he would have the President's Month. They would edit something and then show it to him what just happened the previous month. So those were outtakes from the month that he spent, with the two of them. The near as we can tell, and it's hard to get inside the mind of Lyndon Johnson, it's hard to know, but he was really, almost to the end of the election, was probably more interested in Nixon becoming president than Humphrey. And near as we can tell, the reason is, and Michael Beschloss has done a lot of research about this, is that he didn't want to be the president who lost the war, and he thought if Humphrey got elected, he would end the war, and Nixon might continue it, or at least find a different end to it, and keep his legacy intact, basically. And that didn't change until late, when you see late in the film where Nixon did this thing with the North Vietnamese government, that Johnson kind of finally came around, and he realized that he might lose Texas.
Well, here's some footage from your documentary that shows that Democrats themselves even heckled Hubert Humphrey and Teddy Kennedy. Let's watch.
With a small group of advisors, Humphrey returned to his home in rural Minnesota to pick up the pieces and plan his campaign.
I remember so well in September of '68, after the convention, the whole environment of politics had come apart. I mean, it had become polluted and destroyed and violent. The president's popularity at a low point, the war in Vietnam exceedingly unpopular. The Democratic National Committee, unable to function with little or no money. I was a loser. I was 20 points behind in the polls. Politicians were leaving me like I was a contagious disease.
Humphrey really suffered from that sense that things were out of control, and he was in the administration that had lost control. And when it came to the issue of Vietnam, he didn't have control of that.
Absolutely intense, awful pressure. There never was a day when you could relax.
I believe that the Republican candidate owes it to the people to come out of the shadows.
If you one time have had human excrement thrown at you by a protester, it makes every other protester the enemy.
How badly was he defeated in '68 by Richard Nixon?
Well, he lost by 1/2% of the popular vote, but he lost the electoral election by more because he had certain areas that he didn't carry, including Illinois and a few others that were there. But the popular vote is really close. I mean, it was literally less than 1/2%.
During your documentary, we hear Hubert Humphrey's voice a lot and don't see him. Where does that come from?
I think you've actually dealt with the audio tapes of Humphrey. When Humphrey, a lot of it came from when he did his autobiography. He sent cassette tapes at the time. He recorded on the cassette tapes and sent them to Norman Sherman, who worked for him. And Norman Sherman and Humphrey worked it into an autobiography. Humphrey spoke more than he wrote, especially when he wrote inside the Senate, but he didn't really write outside the Senate very much. So he was better at speaking. So he spoke into these tapes and sent them to Norman Sherman. And thankful that the tapes are still around, and that's what I used. And we converted them to a digital format. And
here's how you treated his world after he was defeated.
In 1969, Humphrey was out of public office for the first time in nearly 25 years. He returned to Minnesota to teach. But within 2 years, he was returned to the Senate by the largest majority of his political career. After an unsuccessful run for president in 1972, he began his final battle, cancer. Then, in November of 1977, his colleagues gathered together in the first joint tribute to a single senator in U.S. history.
Hubert, old friend, we asked you here so we could tell you we love you.
Mr. Speaker, knowing full well the dangers of what I'm about to do, I yield as much time as he wishes to consume to the senior senator from Minnesota.
And I know where I'm standing. I'm standing where the President of the United States gives his State of the Union address. My goodness, how I've longed for that opportunity.
He was luminous in his optimistic belief in the possibilities of reforming America. And he loved people. There was just a palpable humanity in that man.
At Christmas, his family installed a toll-free 800 number in his home so he could call hundreds of friends and say goodbye. And on Friday, the 13th of January, 1978, Hubert Humphrey died peacefully at his lake home in Minnesota. As his body lay in state in Washington, 60,000 average Americans braved freezing cold temperatures to say goodbye.
66 years old?
He's 66, right.
Lyndon Johnson was at, what, 64 when he died, I think.
And it was earlier, right.
How sick was he, and how did he know? I do remember.
The funeral.
Well, I remember the speech, and we weren't in business until a year later, so we didn't televise it. Was that televised at the time?
Yeah, that was a house camera that they had. You know, it was one of the robotic cameras. It kind of it's kind of rigid, but it was a house. It was inside the house. Yeah.
How sick was he?
Well, he died 2 months later, and he had had cancer for 4 or 5 years off and on. So he was sick, and he had this remarkable spirit. That's one of the things I tried to get across in this film was he didn't take anything but Tylenol right up to the end. I mean, he just had this remarkable spirit. He wanted to live through his death and live through the whole process. And he just kept this attitude up. I mean, he was in pain all the time, and no one knew it. You know, he was an amazing spirit. One thing I should tell you about that funeral that's interesting that I couldn't really get into the film. Richard Nixon had been out since Watergate, out of Washington, had not been back. And Humphrey called him on Christmas. Now, he died on the 13th of January. He called Nixon at Christmas and said, "You're coming back to Washington for my funeral. And that's how you're getting back in to Washington."
Did he?
And he said no, and Humphrey said, "Look, I'm a dying man, and this is a dying wish, and you're going to come back." And he came back. And he's at the funeral. You'll see at the end of the film. And that was, he said, "No president, I don't care what he's done, should be banished from Washington. You need to be here." And he invited him back. I mean, this is, talk about forgiveness, and he's dying. And that says something to his spirit, too.
Got one audio clip, because it comes from the book recording that he did where he was talking about the way Lyndon Johnson treated him, and we're about out of time, but let's just listen to this, and
right.
I'll ask you about it.
It would be appropriate for me to invite my friends from the Twin Cities out for a boat ride. So I told them to, gave them the instructions, told them to meet me at the marine dock at 5 o'clock. Then I put in my request for the boat. I was asked who was to be on the, we always had to file a manifest. And I filed the names of those that were to be on the boat with me, and including, of course, their profession or their occupation. This was called for by the President. You didn't just take the boat out. You had to file a list of those who were there, what their names and their addresses and their occupation or profession. Well, about 4:30, I got a call from Marvin Watson of the White House, and he said that I couldn't have the boat. And I said, well, this is going to be very embarrassing to me. And he said, well, this is the order of the President. I was most upset and frankly damn mad. And I said, Marvin, I'm going to be embarrassed. These are people from Minnesota, and they'll never understand how I could invite them and on a boat trip like this and all at once have to cancel it. He said, well, there's not a thing I can do about it. The President has said no boat.
And also there's another story that he tells about how he was only allowed to use prop planes in the United States, and he could use jet planes if he went overseas.
Yeah,
but
there was a whole set of rules. And Johnson, you have to wonder, because it's almost as if he allowed him to plan this whole thing and then pulled the plug at the last minute to make it more difficult for him. But it's really hard to tell. But he never allowed them to come to Camp David. He was never allowed in Camp David. Never was on Air Force One. And one of the things that President Carter did in Humphrey's last few months was he invited him to Camp David, and he sent Air Force One to Minneapolis to pick him up. And they spent a weekend together just talking at Camp David. And that's when President Carter learned who he was, really, because they'd been sort of political adversaries before then. But it was never, wasn't treated as a vice president, basically. But I have to say, I think probably anybody who would have been Lyndon Johnson's vice president would have had to deal with that. And people told me that McCarthy become vice president, he was a second choice, Gene McCarthy, that he would have just been, basically, would have murdered him. It would have been awful.
Where were you born?
Minneapolis, North Minneapolis.
Where'd you go to school?
In North Minneapolis High School, and then I went I left, I saw maybe a month after high school, I left with a road band, went on the road with a rock and roll band for 7 years.
What were you doing?
Playing bass and traveled a lot, and then played music all my life, really, and did a lot of other things. And then went back in the 90s, in my 40s, went back to college and went right through at Hamlin, went right through a master's program at Hamlin. I just decided to go back, and kids were getting older.
How many documentaries have you produced in your life?
Well, I worked on 2 for Court TV. In 1996, I was an associate producer to another producer. Then I did one, I co-produced one for HGTV, which was called Restore America with Bob Vila, and he went around to different states and did restoration projects and did that. And the first 2, by the way, for HGTV were the capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann and the Scottsboro Boys, so I got a pretty good initiation. In 1999, I started my first film, independent film, which is called The Heart of Bassett Place, and it's about an African-American settlement in Minneapolis. Fabulous story. And while I did that, at the same moment, I was starting the Humphrey film. And then a couple years later, I did one on Gene McCarthy. And then over the years, I've done installations, museum installations. I did short pieces for President Clinton and for Vice President Mondale for presentations for their speeches. And I've done other consulting work along the way, but mostly it's been Humphrey for the last 10 years.
So again, if somebody wants to see the 2-hour documentary, The Art of Compromise, Hubert Humphrey, where do they get it?
ShopPBS.org, www.shoppbs.org, or 1-800-SHOP-PBS phone.
Mick Caouette, we're out of time, and we thank you very much for yours.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.